Tom Shear.
Hello.
How are you, sir?
Good. Nice to talk to you again.
Absolutely. I think the first video we did was, what was that, about 7 weeks ago, maybe?
Yeah, sounds about right.
That's right. And that was on the Piano Keyboard Artist series, and it made a very good impression with a lot of my followers. People said, "Oh, Vaughn, thank God that you finally spoke to Tom." And they were delighted to know that I'm going to get you back again on this time the Geek Talk series.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Where we're going to talk deep and geek. Which is good that you're not only an artist, but you're a producer as well, so you can talk the lingo.
Yeah, absolutely.
So first of all, how are you? I heard you said you weren't well. You had a lung infection.
Yeah, I had a upper respiratory kind of thing that was going around, and it wasn't too bad. It was pretty short-lived, but we had to postpone things a little bit so that your viewers didn't get half an hour of me coughing my lungs out.
I see. Well, listen, Tom, I've just returned from Bristol now. I interviewed your friends Mesh.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, they send their regards as well. So
excellent.
They're off on tour to Russia now to do a little mini tour. So
I'm sure they'll have an amazing time. Russia is really incredible for shows.
Absolutely. And have you got? I know you're working on a new album, but have you got any tours planned at the moment or anything?
We don't have anything on the books until April, and I can't really say anything about that other than it's going to be European dates.
Okay.
We just have to wait for some confirmations and some contracts to be signed before we can formally announce the dates. But right now I'm just concentrating on being in the studio and working on the new album.
Well, I hope when you do come to this part of the world, I hope you will drop by the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the UK.
Absolutely, and yeah, make sure you give me a call. I'd love to come and shake your hand and have a beer.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Right, Tom. So just as we did last time, we're just going to talk, and there's no real structure to this. I just want to sort of talk about your production process. As I said, Assemblage 23, you're essentially a one-man operation.
Yeah.
And then when you go live, you obviously bring in session musos depending on the size of the budget.
Sure.
Will dictate how big your band can be. So you obviously write and produce everything yourself. So this will be a fascinating conversation. So let's just sort of start off with sequencing and DAWs. Let's start off with what you're using at the moment and kind of where you started and how you got to where you are now.
What I'm using at the moment are two DAWs. I'm using a Logic Pro Studio.
Okay.
That's the DAW I've used for the longest. I've been a user since before Apple bought it, when it was still eMagic. I think it was version 4 is where I started.
Wow.
So I know that one inside out, and it's very comfortable. But it's also a bit long in the tooth. It's kind of showing its age, and I don't think it's necessarily kept up with some of the more forward-thinking music creation software. So I've also been using Bitwig Studio.
Okay.
And I actually got started on that because I put out I used to have a small record label called 23dB Records. And I put an album out by this Swedish act called Burikusu. And the musical half of that duo is a guy named Klaus, who went on to start Bitwig. So that got my interest there, and it's quite a bit like Ableton.
Okay.
But I think it's the layout and the workflow, for me at least, I think is a little bit easier, and it just fits my creative process.
I see.
So I kind of go back and forth between those. As is often the case, there's things that one does better that the other doesn't do, or vice versa. So having both options is pretty handy.
So you're not sort of necessarily on the most up-to-date operating systems and things like that, because what I've found is when I speak to the people who are actually getting, obviously someone that's on your level that's actually had the success, many of the people that on that level, they're not really focused on so much on being completely up to date. Some of the guys I know, they kind of unashamedly behind the curve as far as technology, not technology, but they sort of not on the latest of technologies. They're more focused on the music and the creative process than the gear, as we talked about last time.
Yeah, I think ideally the gear itself should be as transparent as possible to the process. Like you almost shouldn't notice that it's there.
Yeah.
But and also just to mention the second half of what you'd asked me before. My first sequencer technically was the little 256 step sequencer that was on the Korg Poly 800, which was my first synth.
Wow.
And it was a nightmare. If you screwed up, you had to start completely over again. It wasn't really useful for anything. But then my first proper sequencer was the onboard sequencer on the Ensoniq SQ80, which is actually quite a good sequencer as far as hardware sequencers go.
And also, I also found I was speaking to a guy the other day called Espen Kraft, who's a Scandinavian sort of 80s music purist. And what I also said to him was that when we used hardware sequencers back in the day, it's interesting that you tend to listen more than what you're actually looking at the screen.
Yeah.
These days, I also have to find myself sort of not looking at the screen. And sometimes you will look at something, you'll go, that looks odd. And then because it looks odd, it psychologically starts sounding odd. So that's a bit of a problem.
I think that's a really valid point, and that's something that I recommend producers, especially when you're mixing, is to listen with your eyes closed. All the metering and visual feedback that you get in a DAW is really useful, but it can also be a hindrance, like you said, because maybe something doesn't look right, or you're making audio decisions based on visual feedback, which sometimes is works and sometimes doesn't. So I think your ears are always going to be your best guide. So I think it's good advice to just either shut off the monitor or turn your seat around or whatever, but just use your ears and let them tell you what you need to do.
Well, Tom, you might be flattered by what I'm about to tell you now. Is every time I'm mixing, I obviously use reference tracks, as I'm sure you do as well. And I was using your song "Damaged" recently.
Oh, thank you.
As one, because there's a very fascinating plugin, and I'm not endorsing it. If they want to pay me, I will. It's a great plugin. I think it's by a company called Magic AB, and you can actually load up to 12 different mixes on there. It goes on your master bus, and you can flip in between the mix you're working on and in between the 12 commercial mixes. But it's such a seamless flipping, so you can go back and forth. So I have lots of other songs that I like, and I was I had your song "Damaged," and coming back to the point we were talking on about looking at the screen and not listening. I talked about last time, Tom, I was always amazed how you get this deep bottom end. So when I tried to replicate the bottom end that you had done in the song "Damaged," according to my tonal balance meters, there's a plugin called Isotope Balance, and according to that, when using my ears, when I tried to replicate your bottom end, it showed that it was like off the graph. It was far too much bass. But to me, it sounded right. So there was a practical example of where something sounded right, but according to the software analysis curve, it wasn't correct.
Yeah, there's an old audio adage which I think producers would be good to make their mantra, and that is, if it sounds good, it is good. If you read any production form, people really get caught up in the minutia of things and like, should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? And the answer is always, does it sound good? Does it sound the way you want it to sound? There's lots of rules when it comes to working with audio and production and mixing and all that sort of thing. But the history of music and indeed, production itself is built upon people breaking those rules intentionally.
Absolutely.
Before a band like Cabaret Voltaire came along or something like that, the thought of feeding vocals through a guitar amp, nobody had really thought about that before. Yeah. But now you don't think about, even in pop songs, you'll hear distorted vocals, So your first rule should always be like, does this sound good? If it does, don't worry about the process that got you there. You know, there's 10 different ways to achieve the same end when it comes to production. So if it sounds great, don't worry about the process.
So there you guys, I just want to say to my subscribers and my viewers there, you got that from the horse's mouth. You've heard Tom's stuff. You've heard how great it sounds. Trust your ears and trust your instincts. Tom, there was a software manufacturer or a manufacturer of hardware, kind of, well, they're called Joe Meek, you know, in the UK. And their slogan is, if it sounds right, it's right.
Yeah. Same idea.
We can sum it up onto that. Right, and as I say, I think we talked about this last time as well. I think especially now, people get so caught up in the technicality of it, and I think also it's a lot harder these days because I think in the ideal situation you would have someone write the song, someone produce it, someone mix it, someone master it. But the problem is, and I think you have this problem as well, although you've obviously passed this because you're very experienced, is sort of doing everything yourself and not trying to lose perspective and lose focus. And you said last time that the way around that is you just put a deadline in place and you go, well, it has to be finished by this date.
Yeah, and I think one of the most valuable skills that you can develop as a producer is knowing when to let it go. Yes. Because I think any creative person could work for the rest of their lives on the same song. You know, there's always one little tweak you could do to make it that much better. Yeah. But those aren't generally things that the listener is going to notice. So you have to ask, you know, am I doing this for audio engineers or am I doing this for, you know, musicians? And, you know, of course, there's overlap there. But, you know, there's knowing when to let it go and just, you know, release the song out into the wild is a really necessary skill to develop if you want to be productive.
Yes, and we spoke about it as well last time, Tom, that a lot of these people who get so hard up on the actual technicalities, they tend to be making the music for musicians, and therefore they don't sell it. They don't make a living from it because the buying public are not interested.
And musicians are all broke, so they can't afford.
Absolutely, we know all about this. Right, so I've got a little list here, Tom. Just a few things I wanted to ask you. So, okay, that's pretty much onto sequencing. Let's talk about synthesizers now. What is your kit list of synthesizers? Do you have like a go-to synth that you always go to, or are you completely random?
I always, I'm about 50-50 with hardware and software. Like I think both offer advantages that the other doesn't have, and it's nice to have kind of a mixture of those two. So currently on the hardware side, I have a Korg ARP Odyssey reissue. I have a Moog Sub 37, and I have a bunch of the Roland boutiques, the SH01, the JU06, the JP08, and the SE02, as well as a Korg Volca FM and a Behringer Neutron. And then on the software side, I have a bit of a plug-in problem. You know, they're just cheap enough that it's very easy to find yourself suddenly, you know, buying everything that comes out, and that's definitely a problem I have. But the ones that I find myself turning to again and again is Spectrasonic's Omnisphere.
We were talking about this with Mesh yesterday. I mean, Gary Newman's whole last 4 albums have got Omnisphere all over it.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's a phenomenal synth. Yeah,
it's very expensive, but I think it's a totally justified expense. I mean, the source library and the amount of sounds and the amount of flexibility you have in programming your own patches is really off the charts. And the other ones that I really find myself turning to are the Yuhi synths, like Diva, Repro One, and Hive get a lot of use. And there's others, you know, there's other stuff in there that gets used here and there. Like I always try to find what a synth is good at, and focus on using it for those things. And that's usually how, you know, I make purchasing decisions too. Is like, is there part of my palette that needs to be filled up that isn't really happening right now. So, you have synths that might be good at harsh digital sounds, or something that's nice and warm and analog sounding. And I think there's something to be said for building your studio in that way, with like a specific task that you want that gear to fill, versus just, oh, this is the coolest thing, I have to have this right now.
Yeah, and as I say, it's that we talked about it last time, the shiny object syndrome. And also something I spoke about with Rich from Mesh yesterday was, obviously, we go back to the earlier days of music, and you even further back to the times where it was very difficult to make music. And what I'm trying to point out is that especially the younger producers that have just come into the game, they don't know how lucky they are.
Yeah.
As I said, they don't really appreciate things. Like they'll switch something on and and then I have to say to them, you see what you've just done? Do you have any idea how difficult that would have been 25 years ago?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, really? So they've got, I suppose the pros and the cons are, it helps you focus on the creativity and you're not getting bogged down on problems. However, it does bring a other bunch of dilemmas to the table, which is, as we said, procrastination, not being able to finish, not being able to settle. I watched an interview with Thomas Dolby recently, how he did his first album, and it just sounded so laborious. And
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I consider myself pretty fortunate, because I was right on the cusp there, where when I started out, I was working with tape.
Oh yeah.
So I did that transition over to digital, having done a bunch of music, with an old Porta Studio, and that sort of thing. And it definitely did give me a greater appreciation for how easy stuff is now. But I'm also glad to have done stuff that way, because working with tape, you are forced basically to learn about production and the nature of audio, getting your gain staging and all that kind of stuff right, or it's going to sound like crap. So it sort of forces you to learn, and that kind of got the ball rolling for me in learning about production and mixing.
I think it's also good if you started at that period, you have a genuine understanding of things. So when you see a plug-in emulation of a tape machine, it'll kind of make sense to you.
Yeah.
Understand the processes. I think what a lot of plug-in emulations do now is to hit you need to get your gain staging right, so you don't plug in too hot. And obviously, what's the difference between digital and analog? Was it like something like 18 dB, which is like the difference? So anyway, coming from the background you've done, you obviously understand that, and it give you an edge when working with the newer stuff.
Yeah, I think so. But from a practical standpoint, the greatest part about it is, like, I still think about, when I'm doing some task, like I'm, building a vocal composite or something like that. I'm like, God, I just did that in 10 minutes. That would have taken me hours, and untold amounts of profanity, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Right. So, so would you say your kit list has expanded over the last 5-10 years, or is it smaller, or is it because of, as you said, plugins are so cheaper? I'll just try this one. I'll try this one.
Yeah. I mean, on the software side, it's always growing, because you're just kind of building on whatever's there, and unless there's an operating system revision that breaks it, there's no reason necessarily to get rid of it. As far as hardware goes, I think it's been more or less the same. It's just bits of stuff gets rotated in and out of my setup, and I'm pretty happy with what I have now. So I don't see that changing right now. I used to have a bunch of vintage synths, which are great, but they're also, a nightmare to keep working. Some of these things are 40-year-old machines, and we're lucky to be in an era where there's lots of awesome new analog stuff coming out. So there's less reason, if you want to get that sound, there's less reason that you have to take the risk and roll the dice with a 30 or 40-year-old synth that you bought off eBay and have no idea what what its previous life was like.
you're absolutely right. And I mean, if you just take something like Omnisphere now, I mean, the bottom end that can create is phenomenal. It's it's beyond. I still think Omnisphere is still. I mean, the original Omnisphere came out probably, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. So we're on Omnisphere 2 now, and I think there's going to be an Omnisphere 3. But it's really just been ahead of everything, and it is still pretty much ahead. We sound like we're endorsing it now, don't we?
Yeah, I know. Well, if Eric Persing is listening and wants to throw something my way, that's fine. But no, I'm very enthusiastic about it as an instrument, and I think you're right. It's even though it's not a new instrument by any means, I think it's still light years ahead of
absolutely
almost everything else, especially on a sonic level. I mean, it just sounds brilliant.
Yeah. No. So let's quickly jump onto vocal processing and preamps and stuff. So obviously do you record your own vocals and everything?
Yes.
You do that as well. I mean, there's two schools of thought to that. Sometimes some people say, there are some that say, oh, you shouldn't be recording your own vocals because you're not focusing on performance, you're focusing too much on technical. Then there are other people that say they would not let anyone record their own vocals. But then again, I think it comes down to a budgetary thing, or in your case, you've had success, huge success. So, you've obviously working in a way that works for you. But let's talk about what microphones do you use? Is there a particular favorite you have, or do you use different ones every time?
I'm about to retire my mic that I've been using since the first album, pretty much.
Can I just stop you there? When you said I'm about to retire, I could hear everyone going, no! I think you're going to retire from the music industry.
No, I'm going to retire the microphone, but it was an AKG C3000.
Okay, yeah.
It's an okay mic, a condenser. I found, I've used it to record other vocalists too, and I found that if somebody has a bit of a lisp or something like that, it really exaggerates those kind of sibilant frequencies.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of looking at now, a friend of mine is a bit of a microphone fiend and has been lending me some mics, and he had, there was a guy named Michael Jolie who used to modify these cheap Chinese mics to basically sound like a Neumann U87.
Yeah. And they come close?
Yeah, very close. And I was blown away by the difference. So I haven't, made the jump yet, but I'm looking at there's an American company called Warm Audio that does a mic called the WA87, and it seems to be the one that people say is kind of at the forefront as far as U87 emulations go.
Warm Audio, is that a WA87?
Yeah.
And a frac, because I mean the Neumann U87, which industry standard, that came out in the 60s or in the 40s. The capsule was built in the 40s, I think, and they cost like £3,000, £2,500.
Yeah, and there's my understanding is that at least in one series of it, there's some battery involved that's proprietary, and you can't get it anymore. So it's, I mean, it's irrelevant because the price puts it out of my reach anyway.
Yeah, sure.
But you understand why it's such a favored mic, because if you're recording a vocal, for instance, you almost don't have to EQ it at all. It's flattering to the voice necessarily, not in a way that draws attention to itself. It just sounds great.
And also, Tom, I don't want to assume anything about your music. I'm a big fan of yours. But also the type of music you're doing, you don't necessarily need the cleanest, most revealing mic, because I think you're going to be adding a lot of saturation and distortion and all kinds of things to your voice to give it that grit. So when people, this is just the advice I give to people when they say, "Oh, should they invest in a Neumann or something?" I say, "Okay, it's always good to have a good mic, but it really depends on the music you're doing as well." I think, I always like to talk about, you get different types of artists, and I always like to talk about most artists out there aren't really singers. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but they are musicians that are singing. And that doesn't make them, it's just, I mean, to me, a singer is someone like, Mariah Carey or Celine Dion, or, they've got that beautiful voice. But if we take
it's more technical.
Exactly. But if we take the music I'm into, you know, even like let's say if we take something like OMD, he's not a bad singer, but he's not a singer. He is a musician singing.
Sure.
Chris, you know, Depeche Mode, Neil Tennant, you know, they're actually a lot more interesting than these people with.
Yeah, I know. I agree. You know, I mean, music history is filled with people like this. You know, Bob Dylan.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Tom
Example.
Petty. You know, these guys are not great singers, but they're instantly recognizable, and the content of what they're singing is what people connect with. You know, so there's times where an imperfect delivery is almost lends you know, credibility to it. You know, what the singer is selling.
The classic example when you said their imperfect delivery, I'm thinking Lou Reed, Perfect Day.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you analyze that, it's really, you know, obviously, you know, I'm used to it, but I think if you analyze it critically, it's a pretty bad performance, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
But we had a UK artist here through the X Factor once, called Susan Boyle, and she sang it with an orchestra and everything, and it was just like, and you know, people said, "Oh, it's beautiful," and I went, "It's fucking dreadful." You know what I mean? Once again, she's got a flawless voice, but it's all about the sentiment and the the delivery and everything. Anyway,
I think there's a risk of, and not meaning any disrespect to people who are very technical singers. Like that takes a lot of hard work, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's the same with musicians too. There's a point to where you can become so technical that you're not interesting to listen to anymore.
Exactly. Absolutely.
You know, there's a lot of you know, not to piss off any of your viewers who are prog rock fans, but I've never been able to listen to prog rock, and I'm amazed by the musicianship. But when they're playing, it just doesn't.
Yeah.
Like, great, okay, you can do, you know, 64th note scales up and down fretboard. That's awesome, but it's not really creating something that I can connect to, you know.
Absolutely right, and we see that in modern rock performances now. You know, back in the 80s and the 70s, they'd always do like the you know, they introduce the band and then there'd be like the guitar solo, the drum solo, the bass solo. They don't do that anymore because it's a little bit cheesy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought it was funny because it's like, you know, people are there to see you. You don't really have to prove anything. Like, people want to hear the songs, you know, like whether we think you're, you know, an amazing virtuoso or something like that is irrelevant. The fact that we're there to see your show means that we like what you're doing. So
now we're definitely on the same page, Tom, and everyone that's sort of on my channel and stuff kind of resonates what I'm saying. And of course, the people that often come to my channel that aren't from my channel, they tear me apart because they just. But then again, I would say this is a really sort of, we're like niche, aren't we?
Sure.
Right. Okay. So I'm just going to ask you a few sort of geeky questions, and you know, bearing in mind that there's no right way or wrong way to do things. Let's talk about mix bus compression. When you're mixing, do you use mix bus compression or not?
I don't.
Oh, you don't. Okay.
My belief is that the one part of the process that I'm not involved with, you know, directly is the mastering.
Yes.
And it's two reasons for that. The simplest reason is I find it incredibly tedious.
Okay.
And the other thing is that by the time that I've completed and mixed a song, I've heard it hundreds of times, you know, and I've lost all objectivity at that point to be able to master. So I like someone with fresh ears to do it. But my thinking is always to give the mastering engineer as much of a blank slate and as much flexibility as possible. I know that that's kind of the way things are done these days. You know, people like to mix into a mix bus. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. You know, especially, you know, a lot of electronic music isn't particularly dynamic.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, compared to acoustic music. So I think it has less of an impact there. You know, if somebody was, if you're recording a string quartet or something like that, I'd say, you know, maybe not with the mix bus, because there's a lot of subtleties that you may want to preserve in the final recording. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for electronic musicians to do. I just don't do it myself. I like to give the mastering engineer as much flexibility as possible.
So when you're doing a mix, you will have absolutely nothing on the mix bus, nothing. You'll have some, obviously you'll have sends and stuff, but on the master bus there'll be no bus compression, no EQ, nothing. It's just completely. So you work with the tracks and you just try and get it to sound as best you can.
Yeah, my philosophy is to try and make it sound good before it hits the master bus.
Yeah.
And I may do things like if I'm working with like acoustic drums or something like that, then I might group those together and send them to Ascend and do some compression there just to kind of glue everything together. But my approach is more to concentrate on the individual tracks and do what's necessary to make them sound good. Another thing that I think gets really overlooked with production is arrangement.
Yes.
That's extremely important to how your final mix sounds. So, being conscious of not having parts that are in the same frequency range fighting each other. I mean, you're going to have some degree of that. You're going to have a kick drum and a synth bass or something like that. Those are going to share some of the same frequencies. But if you arrange your tracks so you're, conscious of where you're putting these parts and there's not a lot of stuff clashing, it's going to sound clearer, but it's also going to sound fuller because there's no like frequency holes in your mix. And that's something that I think really gets overlooked, when people are talking about production, is like starting with a good arrangement is as important, if not more important in some ways, than all the magic that you do to it after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, once again, coming back to this age of an abundance of technology and no limit to limitations, it's so easy to just add something on. By the time you get to it, it's just, but that comes with a lot of experience, Tom. Would you find that your productions are more sparse and less cluttered these days than they possibly were, or not? Or is it you just know how to work around it?
They're definitely a lot cleaner than they were in the early days. And I mean, working with audio and production isn't one of those things where you can like, okay, I've learned it. You're always learning. There's always new approaches or new technologies, new techniques to learn. So your journey as a producer is never over. You're always learning new stuff. And hopefully that leads to, improvements in the sound quality of your mixes and all that. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with the approach of like, oh, I'm going to screw around and just put all these plugins on and see what happens. Like, experimentation is a great thing, and you can discover some cool stuff that way. But limitations are also good,
Do you, Tom? Just a more of a random question. Do you ever mix or produce for other people?
Yeah, I do.
You do. You've got clients as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's worth the people watching here to, if you want that nice big fat Assemblage 23 sound, guys, give him a shout. I don't know if he's going to give it. I don't know if he's going to give it to you. I suppose you've got to keep. I suppose even if you are conscious not to, and I'm not saying you'll do this, but I think even if you take on different types of music, the essence of your approach is always going to come through. Am I right? That's with any mix engineer.
Yeah, I mean, for me, part of the reason, aside from just that it's, it's a source of income, but part of the reason that I like to do production for other bands is that you can learn a lot about producing by working with somebody else's material, because it's going to challenge you in ways you get accustomed to the way that you work, the way you arrange, the way you mix. So this forces you to kind of go out of autopilot, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I haven't had this problem before. How do I solve this? Or even something, like dealing with, acoustic drum recordings with overheads and room sound and all that sort of thing. That's stuff that I never really have to deal with my own stuff because it's electronic, but it's a good skill to have. So working with somebody else's material affords me a lot of opportunities to learn, which is important.
And Tom, do you find the people that approach you for mixing and whatever production services you offer, do they obviously approach you because they like the type of sound you have? I mean, or is it's not, you don't do country artists and things like that, do you?
No, but I've done some rock stuff, and I've done some stuff that's kind of out of my comfort zone. So it is, but yeah, 90% of it is dancey electronic stuff.
I think so, and I think it's you get into that positive, what you call the virtuous circle. The virtuous circle, is it the virtual? Yeah, that the positive circle where you're out performing. The people hear you, they listen to your music, they're in a band, or they're trying to get there, and they go, oh, well, we like his sound, we'll get him to mix it or produce it. And that's probably how it naturally transpires.
Yeah, and then, I mean, to put it simply, a lot of people are great songwriters or great musicians, but they don't have any interest in the production side of things.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is totally fine. And in that case, knowing your limitations and knowing when to reach out for help from somebody who can fill in those skill gaps for you is a good thing to be able to do.
This is interesting, and as I'm just going to say to the guys watching this again, guys, I didn't know Tom did this, but if you need, reach out to Tom. I'm going to put Tom's details at the bottom of the videos here, and Tom, you'll give me some links if anyone wants to reach out to you for your production services. They should get in touch with you.
Sure.
Just a few more questions, yeah. Tom, I like to ask these cliche, stupid questions because they are stupid. But EQ before compression or compression after EQ? It's one of those.
Yeah. I put EQ both before and after compression.
Diplomatic.
Yeah. The EQ that goes before the compression is getting rid of stray frequencies that might not be needed, so you're not making the compressor work on frequencies that you don't want there anyway. And then the layer of EQ that comes after the compression is more for the tonal shaping, bringing out detail, and that sort of thing. So yeah, both.
Actually, I just want to say that, Tom, I've actually, that is the most diplomatic, but no, I don't believe you're being diplomatic. That's the most practical, because everyone I speak to will always go, well, the reason, and everyone always gives an answer, but that is actually, it sounds pretty obvious now, but that's actually the best answer. Because you're cutting, and then you're kind of putting back what you took away with a final EQ. Yeah. Okay. I thought that was going to be a lot longer question. To the next one. Okay, Tom, and as I say, on this we can talk for ages, but we've talked sort of about your studio, and that's just general. And you talked last time how when you write a song, you generally tend to use a very basic, like kind of plinky plonky piano sound, something that doesn't distract from the. So you're focusing on the song and the melody rather than the thrills that go then. But let's jump onto your live setup now, because you're obviously a veteran of the the live performance scene. So what is your typical live setup? If we start with backing tracks, what would you run your backing tracks from?
We've used both Logic and Ableton Live to run backing tracks before. It basically, that depends on the lineup. If my drummer is with me, the backing tracks live back with him, and he triggers those, and he uses Ableton. If he's not there, then I use my laptop running Logic, and I just use it because at this point, Logic is just rock solid, and I've almost never had it crash on me. Knock wood, we've never had it crash in the middle of a show. So yeah, that's the backing tracks. And then my keyboard player is previously he was using an Access Fire C. Okay. But he's now switched over to digital, and he's using Omnisphere and a controller keyboard for the live tracks now.
I see, because Mainstage is very popular these days.
It is. I haven't played around with it at all, so I can't really speak to that. I'm generally one of those kind of people that if I find something that works, unless there's some need that I need to fill, then I'll keep doing what's worked for me. So I just haven't looked into it.
That's right. It's yeah, main stage is quite amazing. Against once again, not an endorsement, but a friend of mine, Simon, who's a friend of mine and from my channel, very, very talented producer. He came to visit me the other day and he brought main stage over, and I was blown away by what it did. Like, really, once again, just like, I can't believe this. And it cost like £25. It's like, what's that, $30 US?
Yeah, yeah.
It's just insane. It's just insane. So let's your new album, Tom, how's it coming on?
It's coming along well. You know, I'm still in the writing stage, and I'm probably about 7 or 8 songs into it. I am doing what I told myself I wasn't going to do again after the last album, which is, you know, previously I would maybe have 2 songs that I'm kind of simultaneously working on. The reasoning there is if I get stuck on one, then I can just switch over to the other one and I can stay productive. But what happened on the last album and what is now happening with this album is I just developed like 10 songs all at the same time.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And you know, I mean, it works, but it's kind of daunting because it's sort of like, well, how many songs are done? Well, none of them are done, but you know, and you know, a few months from now, all of them are going to be done because I'm just kind of making this piecemeal progression with all of them at the same time.
Well, that's not exactly a wrong approach, Tom, because there are 2 different schools of thoughts to that. You know, let's say you have a 10-track album, you focus on one song, and I do know a lot of producers, and once again, it's a preferential thing. Some people say if you focus too much on one song, you kind of lose perspective of the continuity. Mm-hmm. You know, whereas if you're bouncing from one to another, you're kind of taking aspects from one song to another, and then you look at this song and you go, oh, that worked with that song, and so it does help with continuity. So, but then again,
there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination that happens, you know.
You're very good with the metaphors, yes. Cross-pollination. But once again, as you say, and you probably know this, Tom, is that what works one time, you might have a song that's fantastic and everyone likes it, and then you go back to the studio and you come up with something new and you go, okay, it worked in that song, let me try a bit of that, and it just won't work. The approach is nothing is ever the same.
Yeah, I think you know, creating music is kind of one of those, not to use another metaphor, but you know, catching lightning in a bottle sort of things, where it's a lot of the creative process is still at this point a total mystery to me. You know, I don't know where the ideas come from.
Yeah.
I always make the analogy of songwriters and producers being sort of like a radio station, and you tune in to these different, you know, melodies or hooks or whatever. So lost my train of thought there.
No, I get you. It's just strange how I often think about this, how the ideas just come from. You sometimes wonder, where do the ideas come from?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So we were talking about how something that works one time might not work another.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's just the nature of things. Like when you create something, you know, when you create the, you know, the quote unquote hit on your album or something like that, it's just this sort of serendipity that happens where it's like, oh my God, these 2 pieces sound magical together. Like, that's incredible. And you just can't replicate that willy-nilly. You know, it's otherwise you'd have 10 hits on your album, right?
Sure.
So, you know, a lot of it is there's just sort of chance and other things that are involved in the process that, you know, dictate why one thing works in one song and doesn't in another.
So, man, these are, once again, these are more like fanboy questions now, if you'll excuse me. Because, you know, I am a fan of yours now ever since I was introduced to you, and not to embarrass you or flatter you. But which song, which is your most popular, your most famous song? And it's because you're not a chart artist, which is a good thing in my opinion. Which song is your most sort of popular, your best seller, or your which goes down the best at live performances? Or
well, I mean, one of the longest running ones was a song of my second album called Disappoint. which
Okay, yeah.
is about my father's
Yeah, yeah.
suicide.
Oh,
Uh,
oh,
and
okay.
it was something that I wrote for myself to try and make sense of the situation. But what I didn't realize was, because there's a stigma associated with suicide. People don't really talk about it.
Sure.
And what I realized is just how common it was. So people were coming up to me at shows and saying, "Thank you for that song. My uncle commits suicide, or I lost my brother, or whatever." And so that's a song that fans have really connected to on a personal level. Damaged is another big one that always gets a really big response
Yeah.
when we play.
It's that, did I disappoint you? Did I let you down? Were you standing on the, did I stand on the shore and watch you drown? Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I know the songs, Tom. You see I know the songs. I didn't realize that was about a suicide. I'm sorry that, sorry to hear that, but
Well, thank you.
But the good thing that's come from that is it just goes to show that being probably one of your most popular songs, it just shows how what you put into that resonated with so many people.
Yeah, and I think that's, as a songwriter, that's one of the best things that's, to me, that's the greatest success, is if somebody comes up, and even if it's one of my songs that I was like, not that keen on that one. If somebody comes up and it really touched them on some level, or they can really relate to it, that's what you want as a musician, or as a performer, or as a songwriter. When I listen to music, the stuff that's really great is the stuff that resonates with me emotionally, or I listen to something and think, yeah, I felt that, but I've never really been able to put it in words. That's the perfect way to describe that. That is,
yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. So on your new album, Tom, as I say, I'm probably plodding, your fans are probably, if some of your other, and the fans haven't put me up to this, they're probably going to want more information. But is there any sort of like general subject matter, or is it your usual sort of subject matter, which is a little bit like the pain? I don't want to say pain, but your songs to me are like really emotional, and that's why they really resonate with me. They like reflective to life, and you're not cheesy. That's what I'm saying. So no, you're definitely not. Guess I'm gonna have to cut and edit this part. Is there any sort of subject matter that you're focusing on this, or is it more sort of, is it all personal? Do you write from a personal perspective usually?
Most of the time I'm writing from a personal perspective. Okay. Music and lyric writing in particular is really therapeutic and cathartic for me. It's a way. I think a lot of people carry around a lot of emotional baggage. There's a lot of stuff, traumas they've been through, or difficulties that they've faced, and they carry it around with them, and it just weighs them down. Whereas, if you have a creative outlet where you can create something good out of something bad, you don't have to carry that around with you anymore. It's sort of like, okay, I've dealt with this, we'll put this over here. And I think I wish everybody had a creative outlet, whether it was, painting or photography or poetry or whatever, because it's a really valuable tool to deal with some of the crap that life doles out to you from time to time.
It does. And Tom, it's something you and I and a lot of art, although I'm not as famous as you, but artists like yourself, I look at the Depeche Modes and people like that, people who do this dark music. It's quite funny. When you meet them, they're the most gentle, soft people.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that? It's like,
absolutely.
I was saying this the other day. I went to a Gary Newman concert. He's just done his 40th anniversary, and a lot of his fans are like, the goths, and really like. But they're very gentle people. So you go to the Depeche Mode concerts, it's the same kind of thing. You go to a Depeche Mode concert, even if it's like 80,000, if it's a stadium, there's no airport security and stuff. It seems like the music that you do and the genre we're in, it really does attract. I don't want to be condescending and say or blow smoke up the arse of the group, but I also find with my group, it really attracts really intelligent people. Very sort of like people who they just, to me, that they're well balanced people. They're in touch with their emotions. You know what I mean. And
yeah, I think I think to an extent that it's, the intelligence kind of drives what kind of stuff that people are attracted to, in terms of, which isn't to say that there aren't plenty of real dumbasses who listen to this kind of music, because I've met them. But
I don't have to say anything, Tom.
but I think, to those people, a pop song with, baby, baby, I'm gonna love you tonight, they can't connect to that, and I think the people that listen to this kind of music are more active listeners.
Absolutely.
They're listening to the lyrics, they're paying attention to the instrumentation and that sort of thing. And, there's another kind of listener where music is kind of sonic wallpaper. It's a soundtrack that's in the background, but they're not necessarily paying attention to it,
Absolutely. I always find there are music fans, and there are people who just consume music like it's bubblegum. It's just
it's junk food. Yeah,
it's junk food kind of thing. Tom, I think we're gonna end it there. And whenever I end it, I always end it at a point where I feel we can go on forever. But I want to, as I said before, if I haven't bored you, and I certainly haven't bored my viewers, I got such good reviews from the last video we did. So I'd love us to do this more often, every now and then.
Absolutely.
Suit you. It's funny how this conversation went from geek talk and then it turned into a really artistic conversation. But that's how conversation flows. As I say, I don't like to structure the conversation too much. But I think we did get a good sort of insight as to what you use, your process, and the geekiness. And we've had a bit of a look into the soul of Tom Shear today, and I think people are going to love you even more. And actually, one thing: do you ever sort of explain your subject matter, or is it kind of more personal to you? Like you told me that the song was about your father's suicide, but you don't tend to go into too much detail. You leave it to the listener's perception.
I used to be very against explaining lyrics to songs, and the reason for that was, I think once you put the song out to the song no longer necessarily just belongs to you. The listener is kind of involved in a sort of collaboration where they're interpreting what you listen to. And there's times where people have come up and said, "Oh, I really like this song. I connected to it because I went through X, Y, Z." It's not what the song is about at all. To me, that's not what I wrote it about, but that's what they took away from it based on their own experience. And I don't want to invalidate that, because it can still be meaningful, even if that's not what's intended. But now if people ask me, I'll talk about it, but it's not something I go out of my way to do, because I think I'd rather the listener, filter it through their own life experience and see what it means to them.
I played your song Lullaby, which is one of my favorite songs of yours, to another friend of mine a couple of weeks ago. And he just said, "Dude, who the fuck is this guy?" And it's kind of like, as I said, I'm a grown man, and when I listened to that, I was completely sober, but I got tears in my eyes. It's like, it really, really hit me. And it's like, there's something in your music, and I'm not trying to flatter you. It's fucking brilliant, mate. Sorry, seriously.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Tom has not paid me to say that, guys. I just
not yet. Checks in the mail.
Tom, so I think what we're going to do is now, have you got any sort of idea when the guys can hear a single? Because I know people are dying to hear your new material. Anything you can say?
I don't really know at this point. It's a bit too early for me to give a definitive release date. We don't really do singles anymore, just because the nature of how people consume music has, in my mind, sort of made them obsolete. I still love singles. I love the concept of, especially from a fan perspective of, well, I can get these bonus tracks and that sort of thing. But people are less tied to formats than they used to be. But it's going to be sometime in the beginning of 2020, hopefully. And as the time gets closer, of course, we'll leak some previews and that sort of thing just to get people excited.
I'd love to just, as I say, keep as I say, I do keep tabs on you, and I'd like to just have a chat some other time, about something else. But Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to have you on the channel. And as I say, when you come to the UK again, I definitely want, all the beers are on me. Yeah.
Excellent. That's a dangerous promise to make, my friend.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm going to push stop here.
Okay.
And I'm going to see you. Well, we'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good.
All the best, my friend. Peace.
Yes,
Peace.
and let me know when it's up, and I'll spread it on my social media.
Absolutely, mate. You're doing a great job with the music, man. Just
thank
don't
you.
ever. When you said retire, I was like, no. It's for the record, guys. He's retiring his microphone, Tom. Keep going, mate. You're doing a great job.
Thank you so much.
Good luck to you, my good friend. I'll see you again. Yeah.
Take it easy.
Take care. Peace out.